how do we think about conservative opposition? That is, people who are technically on our side who don't join with us in every fight or battle in the way that we would wish. This is Dispatches from the Culture War. I'm MD Perkins. My wife and I, over the summer, began reading a biography on Teddy Roosevelt. It's written by Nathan Miller. It's called Teddy Roosevelt, A Life. And it's a fascinating portrait, obviously, of the president. And one thing that really struck me in particular is an account that's given in the early time of Theodore Roosevelt's political career after he was elected to the state assembly in New York State and as a Republican, and how he goes into the New York State Assembly with a very reformed-minded approach, recognizing there was a lot of corruption throughout the government, and particularly in New York City where he lived, and he wanted to do what he could to eradicate that. And there was one issue in particular that he took as one of his first real causes in this fight, and it was something called the Westbrook scandal. And just a little context on the Westbrook scandal, that in the legislative session in early 1882, the New York State Assembly investigated irregularities in the relationship between the New York Supreme Court Justice Theodoric R. Westbrook and financier Jay Gould. Now, Gould was attempting a takeover of the Manhattan Elevated Railway Company and was using insider information and rulings from corrupt state officials to drive down the stock price. Theodore Roosevelt, a young assemblyman, led the charge against this, but was ultimately unsuccessful in impeaching Westbrook from his role as a Supreme Court justice at the New York Supreme Court. The inquiry found Westbrook had been indiscreet and unwise, but was merely guilty of excessive zeal. So that's the context of when I was reading this. It was a fascinating thing to understand just the nature of reform, that these efforts are never easy, they're never fast. In fact, they create divisions among your own factions and allies, because not everyone is going to be fully invested in these efforts. And as Christians, this can be troubling. It can be frustrating because we feel like we should all be united around the same sense of truth and concern. We don't always share those concerns. And so one of the things that we've often seen is the way that people have essentially pit people against one another. White hat, black hat, friend, enemy. If you're not a friend, then you're an enemy. If you're not acting on my behalf, you're an enemy. If you are acting on my behalf, then you're a friend. But that friend means that you are living up to the fullest, description and definition of what I would determine that to be. And so it's real easy to break things down along those lines. But what was so helpful to me actually in reading this history was to see how Teddy Roosevelt actually described the failure of his effort. He obviously put in a lot of effort, and it was not an easy thing for him to go out on a limb and, as a young assemblyman, really put himself out there in this way, creating enemies right away, building some allies that were perhaps surprising or unexpected, but to cut against the grain of what a lot of people were expecting. He has this quote where he describes the response of those who he had hoped would be allies with him. He said, "Big business of the kind that is allied with politics thoroughly appreciated the usefulness of such a judge," he's talking about Westbrook, "and every effort was strained to protect him. We fought hard, By we, I mean some 30 or 40 legislators, both Republicans and Democrats. But the black horse cavalry and the timid good men and the dull conservative men were all against us. I really appreciate that description of the timid good men. He also mentions dull conservative men. He also mentions a black horse cavalry, which I'm not sure who that exemplifies within the historical context. But I can certainly get a picture of timid good men. And just having that phrase and that category for people who I would have affinity for, I would assume are on my side. They're not bad. They're not corrupt. They're just timid. They're not willing to really go out and push very hard on these issues. And so it leads to them sort of stepping back or shrinking back or not speaking out in the ways that I would like to see. When Roosevelt used that term, I realized that I know of men like that. I know of people like that in this culture war fight that I wouldn't consider enemies, and I shouldn't consider enemies. As a Christian, I shouldn't consider them to be actually opposed to what I'm trying to do and the bigger issues of God's law and some of these things that we hope to see expressed in the realities of culture. But they are timid, and they are in some ways cowardly or fearful, or they have other priorities that they are putting up ahead of this. And so I don't have to fully vilify them as somehow enemies opposed to me, but I can recognize an element of weakness, and an element of weakness that's really there in all of us. I mean, I'm susceptible to being a timid good man who has good intentions, I think has the right framework in a lot of ways, but isn't necessarily going to take everything up with the same measure that maybe I should. And there may be a number of justifications for that timidity, but nevertheless, it's there. And we're always hounded by our own limitations and weaknesses. And I think we should probably just acknowledge those as Christians and recognize them in the fight. So when we live in a day when people would really want to divide us over some of these issues that we are not all in lockstep harmony on, but would rather cause us to fight amongst ourselves, and not just to fight over these things and like what's the best practice or what's the best approach, but to really divide along these lines. Like I can't trust this person. I can't take what this person says seriously because they didn't join me in this effort or in this fight, and they don't see this issue with the same level of seriousness that I see it. I mean, in the Christian church, God gave us Christian liberty. And I think amongst Christians, we should probably offer each other some of that liberty, even though it is troubling for us, even though we don't gain the momentum that we would want in every case. I still think that that's probably how we should be approaching things as Christians. Maybe I'm not. Maybe I am just a timid good man. And, I'm more willing to acknowledge that rather than fight against those who don't see things in the same exact way I do. Be curious your thoughts if you have any pushback or other clarifying points you'd like to bring to that. But I just found that whole category helpful to think of. It's not just friends and enemies out there, that there are timid good men. There's even dull conservative men and whatever the black horse cavalry are who maybe are always opposed to these sorts of efforts wherever they come up because they're already internally corrupt or something. That's kind of the impression I get from that description. But timid good men are not corrupt. They're just weak. And we can sympathize with that weakness, perhaps see areas of weakness in ourselves, and have grace for them even when they don't join with us in every effort. So hopefully that's a little bit of helpful historical context from the life and times of Teddy Roosevelt. And thank you for listening.